All right, well, we got quite a few people joined in, so we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Luke Schwartz. I do content over on the MCAT Basics page, an MS1 this year. That's basically it about me. Dr. Ziggy, if you'd like to introduce yourself,
Yeah,
the floor is yours.
absolutely. Absolutely. I'm Ziggy Yoediono. I am one of the associate directors of advising at Med School Coach, basically. So I hope you guys ask lots and lots and lots of questions today. And in terms of my background, I went to Yale for college, University of Rochester for medical school. I did my psychiatry residency at the Harvard Longwood program, and then I got an MBA at Duke, basically. So basically, I was trying to avoid the real world for as long as possible.
I kind of went down that same route. I'm not going to lie. I plan on staying in school as long as possible. But so obviously Ziggy's got a wealth of knowledge in these processes, guys. So definitely ask as many questions as you can while you've got him here with us. So I guess we'll just dive right in, Ziggy.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about secondaries because that's kind of the main thing coming up in all these people's lives right now as they're applying. So when it comes to secondaries, what are kind of your just overall overarching suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I am literally, not literally, I am figuratively in the thick of things right now with all my clients as they're starting their secondaries. And I'm assuming a lot of you who are joining us are too. So I definitely, from a general perspective, I definitely have a few suggestions. First and foremost, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised hearing this. Get started on pre-writing your secondaries as of yesterday, basically. I think we all know that it's a lot, but I don't think you really, I mean, Luke will know this far better than I since he just went through this, but I don't think you really appreciate the tsunami of secondaries until July rolls around and it feels like a dump truck of applications are on your head, basically. And so I really encourage all my clients. I just sent them a mass message the other day. Start pre-writing your secondaries right now, basically, as many as you can. And I think from a sort of logical, common sense perspective, we understand why. But there are a few reasons why you want to do this. First and foremost, you want to be able to turn in your secondaries within 2 to 3 weeks when you get them, basically. And if you have 40 secondaries they have to write, that's really, really difficult to do, basically. So that's one reason. The other reason is that if you kind of wait to the last minute, quite frankly, I think the quality of one's writing for the secondary is compromised and suffers. Because what happens, and this might be the shrink in me coming out, but when you see you have all of these secondaries, how do you feel? You feel anxious, right? And how do you get rid of that anxiety? You want to submit things as soon as possible. And so what you do is, and I've actually had clients tell me this, you tend to rush through your secondaries because you're like, oh my God, I have so many. It's like a production factory. So you churn through them, you want to submit them, and then, each time you submit it, the anxiety alleviates. And it's not until a few months later, you're like, wow, I wrote a lot of crappy secondaries, basically. But in that, in that sort of frenzy to get them in, that's what happens, basically. And then worst case scenario, and I might have had a few clients like this, when you feel like you have too many, sometimes you end up not even applying that year and you end up wanting to postpone. Actually, I just had a client like that, basically. I feel like they felt like they were kind of behind already and they want to defer, basically. And so, those are kind of the unintended consequences of not starting early as possible. Another piece of advice I have more from a content perspective is as you answer whatever prompt is being asked, really try to be as A, granular, and B, evidence-based as possible, basically. And I know this might sound like common sense, but I can't tell you how many secondaries I've read where I feel like stabbing myself in the head with a pen because it's like, general, generic answers that could have come from anybody, basically. What you guys have to remember is thousands and thousands of people are answering the same secondary prompt that you're answering, basically. So I was doing some research today, Luke, just to see, how many people apply. I think I Googled med schools with the most applicants, and George Washington and Georgetown, they get about 12 to 13,000 applications. Can you imagine if you had to read through all those applications and everybody wrote the same generic stuff, basically? It's either going to put you to sleep or lead to other unintended consequences. So you want to be as granular and evidence-based as possible. That helps you differentiate your responses from the pack. Everything is like a bell curve, and you don't want to fall in the middle of the bell curve. You also don't want to be on the far left. You want to be on the far right, basically. And then I think my last piece of my last piece of general advice, and this is going to sound really weird, is really follow the instructions on the prompt. I can't tell you how many secondaries I've looked at where the prompt might say something like, give us one example of blah, blah, blah. And then my client will have written like 3 or 4 examples. If they say they want one example, they really want one example. They don't want 3 or 4 examples, basically. So really read it carefully. I know as you read through different secondaries, you think sometimes there's like some hallucinations going on. You think you're reading the same instruction, but you really, really want to be careful.
No, I completely agree with just about everything you said. I was unfortunately not smart enough to realize that I could pre-write some of my essays and get ahead of the curve. And so I was 100% the applicant you just described, where I waited until they started coming in to look at them and start writing them. And you nailed the feeling like perfectly. It was miserable because every time I would start making ground on them, more secondaries would come in. And then it was just like this massive tidal wave at one point where, right, most applicants apply to a ton of schools. I only applied to like 10 schools, and even just like the 10 applications coming in, secondaries take quite some time to do correctly. And so waiting like I did was a terrible choice. I cannot recommend avoiding that at all costs. And so luckily there is something that I learned about afterwards, but Prospective Doctor actually has on their website a secondary essay database. And in there, it's got just about every medical school's secondary essays. And they actually update it yearly. And so last year should be in there by now. You can go in and actually see like what the prompts were last year. Most schools stick with the same prompts every year because they're looking to evaluate applicants equally. And so they're going to use the same prompts to kind of see what they're looking for. And you can go in and sort of pre-write your essays, especially for like your top schools, the ones you want to get applications into quickly. Like Ziggy said, you want to have a pretty decent turnaround time on them. And so by going in and looking at them, you can have them pre-written, have time to actually think through them and not be rushing through them like I was, just trying to get them in. Because most secondaries have 3 to 6 essays on them a piece. And to write quality essays takes time. And so I was definitely behind the ball on it. So I 100% wish I would have seen this live prior. Another question we get asked a lot when it comes to essays is, can you reuse them for secondaries? A lot of schools will ask similar prompts.
Yes.
And so in your opinion, what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. You can reuse a lot of the questions that you answer for prompts. Again, you want to make sure you read it really carefully and tailor it appropriately. There are a lot of this, in some ways, secondaries are also, while it's difficult to write because of the volume, in some ways it's a little bit easier versus like the personal statement, because a lot of the prompts tend to be very black and white, like list what you're going to be doing for the upcoming year. Well, what did you do during your gap year, things like that. So, in that way, it's very easy to do. So, whenever, like you want to be efficient and effective with your time. And quite frankly, there is a lot of overlap between secondary prompts, basically, among medical schools. So yes, if you can kind of reuse it, definitely do it. But one of the things you want to make sure is that, like I mentioned before, that you're really answering the question being asked. And the other thing is, which I often saw with my own clients, is if you mention the name of the medical school in your answer and then you reuse it, make sure you change the name of the medical school. I can't tell you how many times it's like, I'm so excited to apply to University of Minnesota, while it was like, a Stanford, application or something. Like, med schools know you do this, so it's not like a big shock, but you want every positive advantage, and kind of getting the name of the medical school right is like, that's a good way to go.
Yeah, no, again, I completely agree. I don't think I have anything else to add to that. I think you really nailed it. When I went through, I definitely used like kind of some blanket templates because for one of the questions that a lot of schools will ask is, talk about a time that you failed, address how you went about it, what you learned from it, kind of that style question. And so for those that every school is going to have something very similar for, you can definitely have a sort of pre-written draft in a way.
Right.
And then go back in, definitely edit it, definitely make sure you address the med school as the correct med school. That would be really awkward to go through if you realize you didn't get in because of something as silly as that. So one of the questions we have in the comments is a little off topic, but I'm curious your take on it, Ziggy. It says, what if I have 2 bachelor's Two bachelors, one from another country instead of a master's degree, would that still count as post-bac work, and could that still be as effective applying?
Wow. I mean, wow, I've never been asked a question like that. I mean, I think from another country, that's kind of tough because I think usually when we think of post-bac or retaking courses, maybe because your GPA it wasn't as high as you wanted it to be, usually we're thinking about institutions within the United States, basically, you know? And so in terms of a foreign institution, you know, just having another bachelor's is great, basically. In terms of how it would count as a post-bac, I really, you know, it's, in all honesty, what I would do, I'm sort of thinking in real time here, basically, because I've never been asked this question before, is I would contact MCAS, basically, and ask them, because they have a repository, a database of, you know, post-bac programs, basically, whether it's doing one in college or SMPs, which are special master programs. So I would call MCAS directly, explain what kind of institution you're attending, and see what they say about that. I think you'll get the most direct answer from them. But I think that's a great, you know, sort of issue to bring up, basically.
No, I'm glad you were here to answer that question, because obviously I am no admissions expert, and so I would have absolutely no idea what to advise besides just exactly what you said, reach out to the application services.
Yes, yeah.
Another question we had come in, and I like this one especially because of your specialty, is what's the protocol for talking about mental health and med school application essays?
Oh, that's such a great question, right? You know, so oftentimes I get asked this question like, you know, I'm writing my personal statement or secondary, and I want to include information about this. So it's going to be a little strange coming from me as a psychiatrist to say this, but it's also matches with my personality, which is I'm very risk averse. And so my general recommendation to clients is, you know, unless specifically asked, you always want to be honest. That's first and foremost. But unless specifically asked, I discourage my clients from sort of proactively mentioning any mental health issues that they've had, basically. And the reason is, first and foremost, psychiatric issues are never cured. They go into remission, basically. And one of the concerns I always have is, you know, if you bring up whatever issue, that, you know, while an admissions officer should be very fair about this, I think one of the subconscious concerns they might have is, even if it's in remission, you've gotten the treatment, whatever, that under duress and pressure, which is kind of med school, you know, in a nutshell, basically, that these issues tend to sort of rear their ugly head again, that it could happen, basically. And then what is that going to mean for its impact on your ability to perform well in medical school, basically? And so for that reason, I really discourage, you know, sort of disclosing information like that if you can help it, basically, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. Again, super glad you were on here to answer these. These are kind of stretching my bounds of knowledge.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of questions you can answer far better than I can. So we balance each other out, so that's all right.
Perfect. Another question we kind of mentioned talking about was, should you tailor your secondary essays to the specific schools?
Yeah. I think whenever you can, basically, I think it's a good idea, especially when there are questions about, you know, I was just reading one of my clients' prompts for a particular med school, and it was like, how do your qualities and values align with our mission statement, something like that, which is very specific. In that case, you definitely want to tailor it as much as possible. And even for more general questions, you know, if it's possible to do so, I would try to do it, because, you know, you want every little advantage possible. And, you know, to me, that also means making sure that you really research the medical school ahead of time, really understand what it's about. The more that you know about it at a granular level, the more that you can actually tailor your responses. If you haven't done any research on the medical school, you don't really know anything about it, then it's kind of hard to do it if you're working off a knowledge base of zero, basically. Oh, and that reminds me, before you ask me another question, there is one kind of specific prompt that I wanted to talk about, if you don't
Absolutely.
mind.
Go
Okay.
for it.
So this is like a 2-for-1 special, right? Because the prompt that I want to talk about is that you guys are definitely going to be asked either during your secondary and or interview. This is what I consider a commonly asked question, but a commonly poorly answered one, which is, why do you want to come to our medical school, right? And so people do a well, a crappy job answering this. The sort of common answer that I see, whether it's on a secondary or an interview, sort of goes along the lines of, I want to attend medical school X because you guys have a good mentoring system, you guys have good early clinical exposure. So what they do is they list 5 or 6 great things about the medical school, and then they call it a day. And Luke, the reason that's kind of a crummy response is because what happens is you're essentially doing an infomercial about the medical school to people who know more about the medical school than you do, basically, right? And that's not the point. So if you sort of extrapolate from that, why do so many people do this? The reason so many people do this is they misinterpret the point of the question. And to me, that means you always have to understand what the point of the question is. So for the why do you want to come to our medical school question, the point of the question isn't what's so great about our medical school. The point of the question is, what are the unique strengths of our medical school that are going to enable you as an applicant to achieve your goals as a future physician, basically. That's the real point. So if you know that's the point, you're going to answer it differently. And so if I were going to give you a template on how to answer this question, so I'll model a response for you, and then I'll break it down into a template. So let's make the assumption that when I was in college, I did lung cancer research, which I absolutely did not do because I hated that stuff. But anyway, let's pretend I did it. And let's pretend I'm applying to Duke School of Medicine, or I'm interviewing there because that's where I used to, I worked at Duke before. And let's say they ask, why do you want to go to Duke School of Medicine? So either the verbal or written version of this would be as follows. It's kind of abbreviated, but I would say something along the lines of, so the reason I'm so passionate about attending Duke School of Medicine is because you guys are one of the few medical schools in the country that dedicates its entire 3rd year to research. And the reason it's so important to me is because I did lung cancer research when I was in college. And here I would talk about my position, my responsibilities, any publications or presentations that I got. I'm marketing myself, basically. And then I would end it by saying, and so if I were lucky enough to get into Duke School of Medicine, the way I would take advantage of your 3rd year is I would want to continue my lung cancer research and study A, B, and C and work with X, Y, and Z. So if you sort of break that down into a template, there are 3 parts to my response. Number 1, you cite 1, 2, maybe 3 ideally unique strengths about the medical school. Number 2, you prove your interest in each of those strengths by talking about a relevant experience directly related to that. So it's not like, oh, I just read this off your website, basically, but I really mean what I say, basically. And then third, if you really want to knock their socks off, you do the third part, which is you even talk about how you would take advantage of that opportunity or strength. And that really shows like, wow, this person really took the time to A, research her medical school, B, understand what it's about, and C, really put thought into how they would tailor their own experience to, if we accepted this person. And, you can't go wrong with that. You're going to make a stronger case for why they should invest time, money, and effort into accepting you as an applicant, basically.
Yeah, that is absolutely phenomenal advice and kind of exactly coincides with what I was going to mention about this.
Good.
Going back to how tailoring your secondary essays to the schools, I think it does a really good favor in your part of showing that you're actually interested in the school. If your essays mention, their core values, how you align with their mission statements. And like Ziggy was saying, you don't necessarily want to, whether it's in a secondary essay or an interview, just be like, oh, this school's good at X, Y, Z, and that's why I want to go there. But talk about why, actually not what they're good at, but why them being good at that benefits you and how you can benefit them by attending it.
Exactly.
Also, it really shows that you've taken the initiative to actually look up the school and actually have spent time considering why you want to go to the school versus just, please let me into a med school. I really want to go to medical school. Because again, I feel like that's kind of where a lot of the answers you were talking about come from, is people they don't necessarily take the time to consider the true reason of why. It's more so of just, oh, you're really good at this. I think that's cool. Please let me in.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Go ahead.
I said I couldn't agree more.
One of the questions we had come in was, how many letters of recommendation do I need for med school? So I'll let you answer and then I'll give my take.
All right. Well, the first thing I would say is this. First of all, figure out if your institution has a committee letter. If they have a committee letter, medical schools definitely want to make sure that they get that committee letter. If they don't, they're going to wonder why you didn't get a committee letter. And a committee letter works different for every, that's basically an evaluative letter written by some health committee at your institution, basically. And every school is a little different in how they do it. Sometimes they want you to submit application materials. Sometimes they have an interview for you. Sometimes they also want you to get individual letters of recommendation. But so look for a committee letter, decision tree, right? And then, but in general, to answer the question about how many letters, so the utopian mixture, I always say, is about 2 letters from a science professor, 1 letter from a non-science professor, and then about 1 to 2 outside of academia. Well, not outside of being a professor, like it could be a PI, it could be an extracurricular supervisor, things like that. That's sort of the ideal mix that will cover most medical schools in terms of what they want in terms of letters. The other thing that I say that's really important, and now this is going to sound a little strange to say, is the quality of the letter should be like super duper high, basically. And I just say this because once in a while I have clients who say, well, I asked, this professor, even though he didn't know me that well, but he kind of knew me and he was going to write sort of a positive letter. And I'm like, that's not really going to help that much. It's like the bell curve. It kind of falls in the middle again. And I understand that people do this sometimes because, for example, if you're a non-science major, sometimes it's hard to ask for a letter from a science professor because, you were part of all your classes were very large. You didn't have time to like develop a relationship and all of that kind of stuff. But in general, I would say like 4 to 5 letters.
Yeah, no. So I applied only to Texas schools, right? I'm a Texas resident, so I only did TMDSAS applications. So I don't know exactly how the MCAS system works. So I'm super glad you were here to talk about that. As far as TMDSAS goes, if any of you are applying through that system, when I did it last year, you were only allowed to submit 3. And again, they recommended exactly what you said: 2 from a STEM professors, and then 1 from any other source. So it could have been another professor. It could have been, anyone influential in your life, really. But the one thing that I would recommend is letters of rec, in my opinion at least, are significantly more impactful if you go for quality over quantity.
Oh, yes.
Like Ziggy was saying, if you have someone who you took their class and you interacted with them like once in office hours, and it was a decent interaction and they're willing to write you a letter, that's great if that's all you have. But if you can actually form a connection with your professors, go into their office hours, have meaningful conversations with them, actually let them get to know you, those letters of recommendations, it's very clear when someone's got like a personal letter of recommendation they've had written for them versus, oh, Professor X has this blanket statement that he sends all of his students and puts their name in it.
Right.
And so if you can get a strong personal letter that shows that the person truly knew you, truly understands your characteristics, qualifications as a student, that will go so much farther than having a significant number of mediocre letters,
yes,
in my opinion.
Go
ahead.
Oh, and I just wanted to shamelessly piggyback off what you said about, going to office hours and all that. So to extrapolate from that, Luke, the point of that is, that's not, developing a relationship with a professor or whatever. So that takes time, right? That's not going to happen in 3 days, right? And so that means you need to strategize ahead of time, many months, maybe even a year ahead of who you might ask. And if you're in a class, you want to, as Luke said, go to the office hours. Obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious to everyone, but I'm going to tell you, it should be obvious that you should come with insightful questions, right? You're not there to chit chat and drop by and, talk about the weather or stuff like that. So you want to come by with really great questions. If you can go to review sessions, that's always a good thing to do. Even if you know all the material there, you can ask insightful questions again. And I think another great way to sort of demonstrate your strengths to any professor is if you're able to become a teaching assistant for the class. Usually that means you did well in the class. I don't think they ask people who did crumbly in the class to be a TA. So that probably means you did well. So, that's like another way to do it too. And then, sorry, this is another tangential thought because Luke was mentioning TMD SAS because, Texas had to do their own way, basically.
Yep, that's
a whole nother philosophical discussion. But anyway, that only made me think of, for you guys, in all seriousness, to remember also as you apply to medical school, it's not only MD schools, there are also osteopathic medical schools. There's AACOMAS, osteopathic medicine. I'm not an expert on it, but it's a wonderful field. I would encourage all of you guys to read about what osteopathic medicine is. Quite frankly, I've read the tenets of it, and I think all of medicine should be like that. And, you know, you get to do all the same opportunities. Everything is very similar, basically. So I encourage you guys to read about that. And along the lines of letters of recommendation, if you think you are interested in applying to DO school later, I would strongly recommend that you shadow an osteopathic physician, because quite a few medical schools, quite a few DO schools require a letter of recommendation from an osteopathic physician. So if you kind of have, you know, kind of know this ahead of time, that's good. I've definitely had clients who didn't have such letters, but the point is you want to broaden your opportunities as much as possible.
Absolutely. The one last thing I want to mention before we move on from letters of rec is I've been helping a lot of people with their applications this year, a lot of like old college roommates, friends who are applying this cycle. And one of the things I get asked a ton is, oh, when I'm picking like who should write my letters of rec, should I pick this person who's got this really cool title and is super important? Or should I pick professor at this junior college where I took physics, but they actually got to know me really well? And my best advice is, once again, quality over quantity. And in this case, taking someone who actually got to know you, especially if it's a STEM prof or a teacher or someone who's seen you in an educational setting, take that 100 times out of 10 over a hospital CEO that your dad's friends with, and he's a physician and has met you for 10 minutes at some function sometime, but's willing to write a letter. The personal one on a personal level will go far, much farther than just someone's title backing their name.
100%. 100%.
All right, now that we've ranted about letters of rec for long enough, someone asked, hi, I'm a first-year med student. Can you please tell me the transfer procedure? Our university doesn't have a library and other student resources. It's a new university. I have no knowledge on this. Ziggy, if you know anything about the transfer process.
You know, one of the first things that I learned as a med student that you should do as a physician is, if you don't know, to say, I don't know, basically. So I'm going to use that card here because I don't want to give misinformation. And I'm very brutally honest with my own clients. When I don't know something, I really say, I don't know, basically. So I'm really sorry I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a great question, basically. I think it's good to go to, you know, people within your university, whether it's at the pre-med or pre-health office, basically, even if you have your own advisor or something like that, even a professor. I think those are great people to ask. Sometimes, even if they don't know the direct answer, they can refer you to somebody else who might really know. I'm not a good person to answer for this one, to answer this question, though. Perfect. So my apologies.
No, I would have the exact same advice. I have no idea. I would seek someone who can at least point you in the right direction. The next question we have in the comments says, in your opinion, how do admissions offices look upon reapplicants to medical school, or are they at a different disadvantage?
Oh, that's such a great question. So before I answer that question, I think it's important to understand the statistics, right? So prior to the pandemic, about 53,000 people were applying to MD schools every year, and the general acceptance rate was about 43% a year, basically. When the pandemic started, I actually thought the number of applications was going to go down. I was 100% wrong, basically. Turns out there's a lot of wonderful people out there who want to help. And so the number of applications went up by about 17%. And so it reached a peak of like 60,000 something applications per year, with only about 37% being accepted per year, basically. And now I think it's gone down a little bit more. And now the average percentage of people getting in every year at MD schools is 40% basically. So why am I mentioning these statistics? I'm mentioning it because it shows you how extremely difficult it is. Less than 50% are getting in every year, right? Which leaves about 60% basically. Now, in all honesty, I don't know what percentage of the 60% who don't get in each year reapply, but the point is med schools completely, absolutely expect there to be reapplicants, basically. It's just a supply and demand issue, basically. So there's definitely going to be a lot of reapplicants every year. I don't think you're at a disadvantage at all in terms of being a reapplicant, as long as you have demonstrated that you have evolved your candidacy in a significant way since your last application, right? You don't want to look like a carbon copy from the prior year, basically. So you need to, if you don't get in, whenever I have a reapplicant, the first thing I do is I analyze their application and their candidacy to look for any weaknesses to make sure there are things that they can improve, basically. So if you didn't get in, you know, you need to think, well, what was I missing an extracurricular? Were my shadowing, clinical experience, research experience not strong enough, basically? Maybe my letters of recommendation weren't strong enough. And even if you got interviews, I would do a brutal self-assessment of your interviews and ask, you know, what worked and what didn't work, basically. What could I have done better? So the point is, you really have to do a brutal self-analysis before you apply. Luke knows this firsthand. It takes a lot of time, money, and effort to reapply, basically. And so ideally, of course, you want to be one and done. That's not always the case. That's only the case for 40% every year, basically. And so as long as you have been able to demonstrate how you've evolved, medical schools will not see that as a disadvantage. And quite frankly, I think in general, we have a lot of admiration for people who are willing to reapply because it's so much work, basically, and time and effort. And I have the utmost respect for people who are finding ways to improve themselves, reinvesting all this time and money and effort. I think that reflects so wonderfully on qualities. And these are the qualities you want to see in a future physician, basically.
Yeah, no, the application process is brutal. So if you haven't started it yet or you're going through right now, you're aware that, you know, it takes a lot of money to apply. It's not a cheap process. It takes a ton of time, especially with secondaries and essays, stuff we were mentioning before. So if you're willing to go through that again, I think it shows a lot of determination on your end and that you've spent some time reflecting this is truly what you want to do, because no one's going to put themselves back through this process just for fun, because it's not a fun process. But I would definitely agree on the fact that if you didn't get in, don't submit the same application. You know, you can reach out to the schools. A lot of them will send emails after like interview season and stuff about, hey, if you have questions about your application, we have reapplicant workshops, and they'll go through your specific application and say, hey, here's what we were looking for. Here's where we thought you were deficient for our program. And it's not necessarily that you weren't good enough to get into medical school. It's just that you may be missing some key things that certain institutions are looking for over others. So definitely take the time to reevaluate, put your pride aside, and reevaluate yourself on a truthful level. Just be one-on-one with yourself and think about, where can I improve? What was I missing? How can I go about XYZ in a better way to make me a more competitive applicant? If you've taken this, say you didn't get in last year and you've done absolutely nothing over the past year to up your application or do anything, I wouldn't recommend wasting your time, money, and effort reapplying this cycle. Spend another year, reassess, do activities to help bump your application to make you a more competitive applicant, and then absolutely go back into it. If this is what you want to do. When I went in and someone asked me what my backup plan was if I didn't get in, I didn't have one. I was like, I'm going to reapply until I get in. It's what I want to do. It's what I've known I wanted to do. And so however many application cycles it took, I was willing to do them.
Perfect.
Let's go. We've got quite a few more questions coming in.
Oh, good.
Are you at a disadvantage if you apply to a medical school with 90 credits rather than a full 120 credits and a bachelor's?
I mean, I don't know I don't know the specific credit numbers, basically. So it's kind of hard for me to extrapolate from that question. I mean, basically, you want to make sure you have a bachelor's degree,
Yeah.
by the time, that's what I would say, basically, because I think every university is different in terms of, how the credits are counted, basically. Some universities are on a semester system, some are on a quarter system, basically. So what I would say is just to make sure that you have, you definitely have your bachelor's degree. It doesn't have to be by the time you apply. I mean, that you'll eventually graduate, basically, before you matriculate, I would say, because a lot of people apply during their junior year, basically, and then plan on graduating the following year, basically. So I would say get the full smorgasbord if you can. That's the first time I've used that word in like 50 years. But anyway.
Absolutely. I would say the same thing. As long as you have 90, if you're sitting at 90 credit hours right now and you're planning on taking 15 and 15 to close out the 120 and get your degree, no one's going to look down on that as long as you are going to have your degree finished by matriculation. That's the one thing they're going to be looking for. So it's not going to be looked down upon if you're applying at 90. I think lots of people do, especially if you want to matriculate straight out of undergrad. I think that's kind of your only option. So I definitely don't think it's going to be looked down upon at all. Ziggy, you got a shout out from Emily Deans from residency. She wanted to let you know she's glad you're doing well.
That's awesome.
Sorry, I'm scrolling through trying to find more comments right now. Here's one that says, what was your most meaningful pre-med experience?
Oh, God. Uh, well, first of all, I graduated from college a million years ago. So that, I mean, I feel like I almost have to get into a time machine to go back there. I mean, in terms of a meaningful pre-med experience, well, you know what it was? I'm going to be honest. I mean, this is going to sound super nerdy, but it was the fact that I was able to get an A in organic chemistry both semesters. I was really proud of myself.
As you
And
should be.
and I can't take credit. I have to actually thank my parents, which I wasn't thankful at the time. They forced me, and I really mean this, they forced me to read the entire 850-page organic chemistry textbook the summer before I took it. And my dad had, if you guys remember, it's all about reactions. So he had me create a chart with every single reaction in the book where it all connected to each other. So I had, it looked like a mural on the wall. Every single connection, every single reaction was on there connected. And I sat in front of the wall every single day and memorized the whole chart basically. And it really paid off because once I took my organic chemistry exams, it took me literally like 15 minutes to do every single one of them. So thanks, Dad, for torturing me.
Yeah, no, I definitely did not go into OChem that prepared or prepared at all. So you should definitely be proud of that grade because that is one of the most brutal courses I think I've ever taken.
Yeah,
and I enjoyed it personally. Like I thought it was a fun subject.
Yeah.
It was just difficult.
Yeah.
For me, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say I think I was also traumatized in the process, which is probably why I became a psychiatrist.
Everyone's got to have a backstory somewhere, you know. For me, my most meaningful pre-med experience was actually, I was very fortunate. I was a medic in the military before applying to medical school. And so one of the missions I got to go on was a humanitarian mission up to the Arctic Circle to help relocate an Inuit village because their original village was built on top of permafrost, obviously. And so when like the jet stream shifted, the permafrost started melting, the village started sinking. So they applied for a federal grant for us to come help relocate them upriver like 9 or 10 miles. And so I got to go out there, and I was the sole medical provider for not only our team, but also the area. And so it was a super cool experience. That was kind of the first time that I truly saw what just an utter lack of medical care looked like. And so that was a very defining moment for me, because at the time I knew I wanted to practice medicine, but I didn't really know in what form or fashion, whether it was nursing school, PA, physician. And it was there where I kind of realized that this is truly what I wanted to do, and addressing the lack of adequate care in a lot of our rural areas and just across our nation, even in inner city areas, was kind of one of the things that I really wanted to advocate for going forward. And so that was kind of what I wrote about on a lot of my essays and stuff.
Yeah.
It was my defining moment of, okay, this is why I want to be a doctor. This is what I want to do in my life. Obviously, not everyone is fortunate enough to get random opportunities like that to come up. So you definitely don't need something extravagant like that at all. I don't want you to think if you don't have something as out of pocket as that you're not going to get in, because that's a very unique story in my opinion.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a lot of other experiences that will get you where you want to go.
100%.
One of the next questions we have is, how can I tell if I'm ready for the next application cycle or need to take a gap year?
Well, I think it's similar to the reapplicant issue, basically. I think what you have to do is assess your candidacy and determine if you have any weaknesses, right? And so these areas that you need to assess fall in the following buckets, right? Academics, right? Seeing where your GPA is. Sometimes people who have maybe a total or a science GPA around the 3.0 range should think about some kind of post-bac program or SMP to get their grades up, basically, because the average total GPA for MD applicants is around 3.7-ish, and the science is around, the high 3.6s, right? So if you're hovering around the 3.0 range, unless you have a real extenuating reason, circumstance for that, you might want to think about, taking courses to show that you can handle that rigor, basically. So academics is one area to assess. Number two, of course, is MCAT, basically. You want to see where you are with that. So if you're not, if you're not around the 510 to 515, maybe for MD schools, if you're close to the 500s or whatever, you might want to rethink taking the MCAT. I have a whole other thing on that, but that's another area. And then, the other bucket is to, like I said before, look at your extracurriculars, right? So do you have the following, which is clinical experience, which means directly interacting with patients? Do you have shadowing experience? Do you have research experience? And yes, you need to do research, even if you don't want to be a researcher later, basically. And then do you have community service, which is giving of your time, basically. Those are the four areas that medical schools look at. So those are, that's one bucket to assess, which is candidacy. And then the other bucket to assess is, if you applied, to look at your application and make sure it's the best quality possible.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think I really have anything else to add to that. I think that was a very well encompassed answer there. Next question we have, I have my answer in my head already, so I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about it. Is scribing or medical assistant more beneficial for med school?
Ooh.
I'm assuming they're meaning like in the application process, which one looks better, or
right. Scribing or medical assistant? That's a good question. I mean, nobody has ever asked. I mean, honestly, Luke, do you have thoughts about it? Because honestly, I don't really have any predetermined thoughts about this.
Yeah, so I mean, after reading it, my honest answer is it doesn't matter. Whichever one that is going to be more meaningful for you. If you hate typing on a computer and hate just scribing, I would recommend not scribing. They're both good clinical experience. You'll get to interact with patients. You'll get to see a lot of the kind of behind the scenes of a hospital and how things operate. And so as long as you're sitting there absorbing the information, absorbing the experiences, and thinking about how it's affecting your path to medicine, I think they're both awesome opportunities, and you'd be a fool to turn down either of them.
Yes.
So in my opinion, it doesn't matter.
Well, no, I mean, I think now that I've heard that, that makes complete sense. But to extrapolate from that question that was asked about scribing versus medical assistant, I will say in terms of clinical experience, those two kind of experiences, along with things like EMT, hospice volunteer, clinical research, are sort of the quote unquote better experiences to have or to try to obtain versus something like volunteering in a hospital if possible. And it's not to downplay volunteering in a hospital. Any experience you can get is great experience. So it's not to downplay that. The issue is everyone and their mother does hospital volunteering. And so it's harder to differentiate yourself on the work activity section when you write about it in a personal statement, when there's only so many ways you can bring a blanket to a patient, right? And so, with scribing, medical assistant, all those other things, there's more in-depth patient interaction. There's more in-depth complex responsibilities that go along it. And I think you'll get more out of it. Now, that being said, if you can't get any of those sort of ideal experiences that I had mentioned, and all you can do is hospital volunteering, that doesn't mean you should still do it, but B, you have to think outside of the box and try to find opportunities within that experience where you can differentiate yourself. And so I once had a client who, volunteered in an emergency room, and I was like, and then he was telling me what he did. And one of the things he mentioned is, oh, and by the way, I'm responsible for training all the other volunteers. And that led to a brainstorming session where he ended up creating a training manual, proposing creating a training manual for all the other volunteers. So he was able to sort of, find a silver lining within that very common cloud, basically. I just made up a proverb, but you get the point.
No, absolutely. And I would agree wholeheartedly on that. If it comes down to volunteering or scribing or medical assisting, by being a scribe or being a medical assistant, you're like an integrated part of the medical team. You're part of the patient's care team. And so I think it just kind of gives you more insight into how healthcare teams work and the inside of how hospitals work and just the all-encompassing aspect of patient care. So I think it's a little more valuable in that sense. But obviously, scribing jobs are becoming more and more difficult to come by. Everyone is kind of applying for those because if you're going to spend time in the hospital, you might as well get paid for it, right? And so if volunteering is all you can get and the only in-hospital experience you get, don't turn it down by any means. It's definitely still very valuable and you can learn a lot from it.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. You guys are asking great questions. We only have 14 minutes left, so keep them coming. Yeah. I can't believe how much we've been able to cover.
We just to let you know, we've gone through none of the pre-planned questions. Yes. I love it because this is so much better. Yes. Another question we had come in was, do you think that 3 to 4 years of high-level research experience within a medical school is valuable even if not published before applying to medical school?
Oh, even if not published, yeah. So I think any kind of research experience is only a plus, basically, right? And if you've done 3 to 4 years, I think that's phenomenal. Now, I do think getting, so it depends, right? If you want to go to a very research oriented medical school, then I would argue, if I sort of think, if I benchmark the clients that I worked with who sort of got into the Harvards and Hopkins or, those kind of places that are considered very research oriented, to be honest, most of them had quite a number of publications, quite a number of presentations, basically, because that's the expectation. But if you feel like, I've done this research, but it's not really an integral part for me to go to necessarily research-oriented medical school. Maybe you want to go to a more primary care-oriented medical school. I think that kind of experience is a phenomenal experience to have, basically. I don't know, Luke, what do you think? Any more insight about
I
that?
completely agree. So to kind of put it into my personal perspective, research wasn't something that I was interested in. I did it just because, I did my mandatory time to do research, to have it on my application. And one of the reasons I think everyone should do research outside of that it looks good on the application is some people get into research thinking, oh, it's not my thing, and then end up falling in love with it and completely change their career trajectory because it's something they just weren't exposed to and didn't realize they would love it. For me, it was kind of the exact opposite, though. I went into it thinking, oh, this is going to be super cool. Like, I'm a huge science nerd. This is going to be the best. And I got into my lab and I was like, there's no way I can do this full time. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. So there's value in learning what you do and don't like. And so for that reason, I think it's great to do research. As far as having that much experience, I think that's one of the things that will definitely set apart your application, because I've looked at a ton of med school applications and have a ton of friends who are doing the process now. And obviously, the vast majority of them have research experience, but it's a semester here, a semester there. So to have that much, I think is definitely an advantage. It's definitely a really cool opportunity you got to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback, I know sometimes when people who are risk averse to research, they think that, oh, the only kind of research I can do is like bench work or something like that. And that's not true. You can do clinical research. It doesn't even have to be in a hard science. It can be in humanities. It can be in other areas. I've had clients who do it in the area of like psychology, other things. So I think there's sort of this, like, it's like a Pavlovian response. We hear research and you think of a test tube, right? And, it doesn't have to be that way. There are other types of research that can be very fulfilling. So keep that in mind also.
That's a great point. And I wish I would have thought about that when I was going through undergrad and stuff, because my undergrad major was nutrition. And so to be able to do community research and community nutrition and stuff, I think would have been a very drastically different experience for me. And I probably would have enjoyed a lot more versus the hard science test tube style lab that you're talking about. And I wish someone would have said that to me when I was going through undergrad. So great point to bring up. Next question is, generally speaking, how many schools should I apply to?
Oh, such a great question. All right. So if I'm being fair, I think if you ask most advisors at Med School Coach, I think they would say around 25-ish, basically. But because you're talking to me and I'm weird and I'm risk averse, I would say anywhere between 30 and 40, basically. I mean, I really do tell all my clients this. It's just because, I cited the stats before of how competitive it is. And so, I think if you're a very, very strong applicant with a strong MCAT, strong GPA, strong extracurriculars, you can err towards the side of 30. But I think if you are maybe sort of more of the average type of applicant, or if you're a reapplicant, I would kind of go closer to 40, which is why it goes back to, where we talked at the beginning, pre-writing your secondaries is very important, basically. Otherwise, you're going to want to only apply to 5 places, basically.
Yeah, so my take on it, which I love having you on here, Ziggy, because I feel like we have very opposing takes on certain issues, and it's really nice to hear the other side. But I'm much less risk adverse, and so I think it becomes a very personal question you have to sit down and address with yourself, is where do I stand as an applicant? Have I just checked the boxes I've been told to check and nothing beyond that? Or am I a rock star applicant that's got X, Y, and Z above and beyond? And if you're one of those, you can kind of err towards that smaller side of schools. Or you may be sitting there and think, wow, I really didn't do a whole lot of volunteering. I don't have a ton of clinical experience. I've got a little bit here and there. And if you're on that side of the spectrum, definitely push it more. So I don't think there's one blanket answer to kind of tell people. I think it's something you have to address within yourself. Obviously, we can sit here and give advice all day long, but at the end of the day, it's your decision. Personally, I skirted on the lower side just because I was trying to avoid costs, to be totally honest.
That's
And it was a
fair.
huge risk.
Fair.
I knew going into it that there was a chance I was going to be regretting this decision later on. But I also knew between the military and other stuff that I had a fairly strong application. And so I was willing to take that risk. So for me, I just kind of did a risk reward thing.
Yeah.
But again, everyone's different. If you want to just play the numbers, like you said, it's very competitive. 40% of people get in every year. So if you're just going off of numbers, apply to a bunch. If you can make it happen, make it happen. The more you apply to, the bigger your odds of getting in are. It's just that simple.
Right, right. And, you know, I think, to be fair, finance is a very big consideration for everybody. And that is something that should be taken, you know, because applying one medical school costs a lot, you know, so, you know, and everybody has a different financial situation. That's definitely something to take into account. And I would just add, even if you applied a lot of medical school, you still want to be strategic in how you create your med school list. When I work with my clients, I really go through a lot of steps so they come up with the best list possible. First and foremost, I think you always want to apply to however many you're applying to, that the majority should be schools where you're competitive at in terms of GPA and MCAT. And then you want to take other things into consideration. And that's a very personal choice. You know, it could be based on geography. It could be based on personal interest. It could be based on mission statement. It could be based on environment. I mean, I've had clients who talk about I had one client who said, I only want to go to med schools where it's warm. And then I had another client who said, I only want to go to med schools where it's cold. So, you know, because everybody's very different, basically.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think that's definitely good stuff to take into consideration. Our next question is, retaking the MCAT in August, would that be too late for this cycle, or should I still move forward with this cycle's application?
I think it's too late because it takes about a month to get your MCAT scores back. And if med school, because you should be indicated that you're going to be taking the MCAT. And so med schools aren't really going to do a holistic assessment of your application until they get that MCAT score back. The latest I actually recommend that clients take their MCAT for the year that they're applying is end of May, kind of early June if possible. Do people take it a little bit later than that? Sometimes, yes. It's not the end of the world, but I do think August is quite a bit too late in my opinion.
I 100% agree. I think August is definitely pushing that outer boundary. Is that to say there's no chance it could happen? No. I mean, there's always a chance. However, it's later than I would feel comfortable spending the money to apply on personally. Once again, it's kind of a personal decision. I was fortunate to have an awesome pre-med advisor at my undergrad institution, and she always gave us the exact same advice you did. Late May, early June is kind of the latest you want to take going into a cycle.
Yep.
Next question we got is, how many hours of valuable primary care shadowing hours and volunteer hours should a strong applicant have?
Yeah. Oh my God, I hate answering this question, but let me think. I mean, I think if, again, I'm doing sort of a retrospective analysis of my own clients, and some people have hundreds of hours, quite frankly. Kind of depends when you get started. I mean, I always tell people maybe at least 100, if not more, basically, is sort of a good way. I've definitely, the director of advising for med school coaches said like 50 to 100 for shadowing. I say 100, again, risk averse. So, I think if you want a mixture of quantity and quality, basically, too. You want to make the most of optimizing your experience. But, I think, around the 100 mark, if you can get more, that's great, plus or minus.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think 100 is a great number to shoot for. I think it's also a great opportunity to bring up the fact that hopefully this is kind of something you've been thinking about doing since freshman year. If there's anyone in high school watching right now or going into freshman year, start this stuff early, because these hours sound like a lot. However, if you start it 4 years prior to your application, 3 years prior to your application, it's very doable, and it actually doesn't take as much time as people think. The reason it always seems so stressful is because people come to sophomore, junior year and realize, oh crap, I'm applying to med school.
Exactly.
I've got to get 300 hours of this in, 100 hours of this in. And so if you can plan ahead, planning ahead is by far your best bet here.
Yes, plan ahead. That's right.
This question is going to be good for you, Ziggy, because you have a lot of admissions experience and I don't. It says, are there any American med schools that accept Canadian applicants and have the same fees as Americans do? I have no idea.
Oh my
Ziggy?
God. Well, I don't know about the fee part. No, there are definitely a lot of U.S. medical schools that accept Canadians, basically. I don't know them off the top of my head because there's like a ton of them, basically. But if you literally Google US medical schools that accept Canadians, you're going to get a bunch of great links, basically. That's basically how I find everything in life. Whatever I think, I put it in Google, and then something great comes up, basically. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot. I'm working with some Canadian applicants right now, basically, and they basically, you can look at sort of I think there is a list of schools with the highest percentage accepting Canadian applicants. So definitely take a look at that. In terms of the fees and all that kind of stuff, in all honesty, I really don't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, my only advice would be to reach out to the institutions you're considering applying to, reach out to the application services, and they'll have someone or be able to point you to someone who has a lot more knowledge in that area specifically. Ziggy, we are kind of running out of time. We got about 3 minutes left. Are there any hot topics you'd like to hit before we kind of go our separate ways?
In the last 3 minutes? Well, I think it's going to sound a little odd since all we've been doing is giving advice on get started early, hurry, work hard, blah, 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 blah. So my advice is this, to use a horrible cliche, we obviously know that applying to medical school is a marathon and it's not a sprint, basically, right? And so in all seriousness, sort of coming as a psychiatrist, your mental health is very important. This is sort of like a never-ending process. And after you apply, you're going to have med school, and there's, it's just like an ongoing train track, basically. So, make sure to take time to take breaks regularly. Even if you have to schedule that in. Every Friday, I'm going to go out. I'm going to walk to the shop. I'm going to go to the park. I'm going to play with my dog. Do something because if you don't, in all honesty, it's like you blink your eyes and weeks pass by and you feel tired. And when you don't feel good, you're not going to do your best work. I'm not saying anything that nobody doesn't know already, basically, but just because you know it doesn't mean you practice it, basically. And so I think Luke can definitely speak much more to this than I can because he just went through the process. But I really think self-care is very important. It's good for your mental health, your physical health, and you're going to be the much happier applicant and future medical student if you do that.
Yeah, 100%. That's something I think you'll learn pretty quickly going through the rigorous pre-med courses, right? Being pre-med isn't easy. Organic chemistry sucks. Biochem is hard. Physics is brutal. Like, you take a lot of very difficult courses that are going to take a lot out of you. And so, I think it's kind of a good thing in a way because obviously med school and being a physician isn't an easy course. It's emotionally draining a lot. You're put in a lot of emotionally draining situations. Physically, it's exhausting, especially as, interns, residents, new attendings. You're putting a ton of hours in. And so finding ways to take care of yourself is something that is incredibly important. And being able to establish those healthy habits during undergrad will definitely set you up for success going into it, I think. For me, it's working out and exercising or just like spending time outside. I can sit outside and listen to music forever. It's relaxing. It's calming. It kind of just helps me do a little mental reset. I think just kind of figuring out what works for you, what makes you tick, what kind of calms you down is something definitely worth exploring while you're in undergrad. And things are stressful, but not as stressful as they're going to be. So I think that's great. I think it's great advice. Definitely take care of yourselves because if not, this process will be even more grueling.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, we have hit 7 or 8 p.m. Eastern.
Wow.
So, Ziggy, is there any last things you want to say before we kind of go our separate ways?
Well, just thank you to everybody who participated and asked great questions. Thanks to you, Luke, for being an amazing sort of co-host along with me. I had a great time today.
No, Ziggy, thank you for being here. It was an absolute pleasure. This is one of the most enjoyable lives I've done. I feel like your answers were so well-rounded. I learned a lot sitting here. So definitely thank you for being here. And so make sure to follow Shrink Who Loves Pink's Instagram page, the MCAT Basics page, and obviously you're probably following Med School Coach if you're here. But I'm going to try to make some videos answering the ones we didn't get to. Ziggy, feel free to do the exact same if you'd like. And guys, just thank you for being here. Thank you for participating, and good luck this cycle.